What are the BBC's guidelines on impartiality? Do they apply to Gary Lineker? Match of the Day presenter Gary Lineker has been asked to step back from his hosting duties on the BBC show after becoming embroiled in a row over impartiality. However, a former BBC executive has said there is a lot of confusion over whether the corporation's guidelines should apply to Lineker, who works as a freelance broadcaster. Here the PA news agency takes a look at the BBC's rules on impartiality. What do BBC guidelines state? The BBC says that it is committed to achieving due impartiality in all its output, describing it as fundamental to our reputation, our values and the trust of audiences. The corporation's guidelines state that the impartiality must be adequate and appropriate to the output, taking account of the subject and nature of the content, the likely audience expectation and any signposting that may influence that expectation. It adds that BBC output must always scrutinize arguments, question consensus and hold power to account with both consistency and due impartiality. Richard Sambrook, former Director of News of the BBC and Director of BBC Global News and the BBC World Service, told the PA news agency that impartiality is crucial for the BBC and staff in everything they do. What is the BBC policy on social media? The BBC's guidelines note that social media is now part of everyday life and that all of its staff are free to engage in social media activities if they wish. However, they state that similar to official platforms, all activity, whether it is in a professional or personal capacity, should be informed by the editorial guidelines. A clear distinction should be made between BBC spaces which are run by the BBC for BBC purposes and personal spaces which are run by staff or BBC talent for their personal purposes, the guidance states. What did Lineker do? Lineker has been reprimanded by the BBC after responding on Twitter to a Home Office video in which Home Secretary Suella Braverman unveiled the government's plans to stop migrants crossing the Channel on small boats. The ex-England striker wrote, "There is no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s. The BBC said it had decided that Lineker would be stepping back from hosting duties on MOTD until they had an agreed and clear position on his use of social media. Do the BBC guidelines apply to Lineker? Lineker is a freelance broadcaster for the BBC, not a permanent member of staff, and is not responsible for news or political content, so does not need to adhere to the same rules on impartiality. His Twitter remarks were made on his personal account, which does not include an official link to the BBC or MOTD in his bio. However, BBC guidelines also note that figures that are clearly identified with the BBC are expected to behave appropriately and in ways that are consistent with the BBC's editorial values and policies. Mr. Sambrook told PA, for a sports presenter in their personal life to express views that aren't impartial is not as serious as if it was a news journalist.